Question 1. The audit findings indicate a potential data exfiltration event involving sensitive customer information. The ethical hacker has been tasked with investigating the incident. Which of the following actions best aligns with U.S. federal regulatory frameworks and ethical best practices for handling such a scenario? Option A. Immediately perform a full forensic image of all affected systems and relevant logs, meticulously documenting each step, and consult with legal counsel regarding data privacy obligations under applicable U.S. federal laws before proceeding with further analysis or containment. Option B. Begin analyzing the exfiltrated data to understand its content, and then share findings with other security professionals on public forums to solicit advice on containment strategies. Option C. Access and analyze all network traffic logs from the past 6 months, regardless of their relevance to the current incident, to identify any historical security weaknesses. Option D. Initiate immediate system-wide data deletion protocols on all potentially compromised servers to prevent further exfiltration, assuming this will contain the threat. The correct answer is A. Immediately perform a full forensic image of all affected systems and relevant logs, meticulously documenting each step, and consult with legal counsel regarding data privacy obligations under applicable U.S. federal laws before proceeding with further analysis or containment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between the need for rapid incident response and the strict adherence to established legal and ethical frameworks governing data handling and privacy. The ethical hacker must balance the urgency of containing a potential breach with the legal obligations to protect sensitive information and maintain the integrity of evidence. Failure to do so could result in legal repercussions, reputational damage, and a compromised investigation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes the preservation of evidence in compliance with relevant U.S. federal laws, such as the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, if patient data is involved, or the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, if minors' data is at risk, and the Stored Communications Act, SCA. This involves meticulous documentation of all actions taken, ensuring that any data accessed or collected is done so with proper authorization, and in a manner that minimizes privacy intrusion. The ethical hacker must also consider the chain of custody for any digital evidence to ensure its admissibility in potential legal proceedings. This methodical approach upholds professional integrity and legal compliance, which are paramount in cybersecurity investigations. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that immediately wipes or overwrites the affected systems without proper forensic imaging and legal authorization would violate multiple U.S. federal laws and ethical guidelines. This action would destroy crucial evidence, hindering any potential investigation and prosecution, and could lead to severe penalties under laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA. It also demonstrates a disregard for due process and the rights of individuals whose data may be compromised. Another incorrect approach would be to share sensitive client data with external parties without explicit consent or legal mandate. This directly contravenes privacy regulations like the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, or HIPAA, leading to significant legal liabilities and a breach of trust. Ethical hacking demands strict confidentiality and adherence to data protection principles. Finally, an approach that involves unauthorized access to systems beyond the scope of the incident, even with the intention of finding the root cause, constitutes a violation of the CFA and ethical boundaries. Ethical hacking must be conducted within clearly defined parameters and with explicit authorization to avoid becoming an unauthorized intrusion itself. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should follow a structured decision-making process. First, immediately assess the scope and nature of the incident. Second, consult the incident response plan and relevant legal counsel to understand jurisdictional requirements and data privacy obligations. Third, prioritize evidence preservation through forensic imaging before any remediation actions. Fourth, document every step meticulously. Fifth, communicate transparently with stakeholders, adhering to legal and contractual obligations regarding disclosure. This systematic approach ensures that both the incident is effectively managed and all legal and ethical standards are met. Question 2. The performance metrics show a consistent and escalating pattern of unauthorized access attempts and data exfiltration originating from a third-party vendor's cloud infrastructure, impacting the client's sensitive customer data. The ethical hacker team has confirmed the validity of these incidents. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action to mitigate further damage and comply with data protection regulations? Option A. Rely on the vendor's assurances that they are addressing the issue internally and await their report before taking any further action. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive forensic investigation into the vendor's systems, in parallel with immediate containment measures on the client's network to isolate affected systems and prevent further data loss, while preparing for mandatory breach notification. Option C. Immediately sever all ties with the third-party vendor to prevent any further exposure and inform the client of the termination and the reasons for it. Option D. Advise the client to publicly disclose the potential breach to manage reputational risk without confirming the full extent of the compromise. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive forensic investigation into the vendor systems, in parallel with immediate containment measures on the client's network to isolate affected systems and prevent further data loss, while preparing for mandatory breach notification. Explanation. The performance metrics show a significant increase in reported security incidents originating from a specific third-party vendor that provides cloud-based data storage services. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for rapid incident response and data protection with contractual obligations and potential legal ramifications related to data breaches. The ethical imperative is to protect the client's data while adhering to the agreed-upon service levels and regulatory compliance. The correct approach involves a structured, evidence-based investigation that adheres to the established incident response plan and relevant data protection regulations. This includes immediate containment, thorough forensic analysis, and transparent communication with the client and relevant authorities as mandated by law. This approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes data integrity and client trust, while also fulfilling legal and contractual duties. It demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to mitigating harm, which are core ethical and professional responsibilities. An incorrect approach would be to immediately terminate the contract with the vendor without a proper investigation. This could lead to data loss, disruption of services, and potential legal disputes, failing to meet the duty of care owed to the client. It also bypasses the necessary steps for forensic evidence collection, which could be crucial for legal proceedings or for understanding the root cause of the breach. Another incorrect approach would be to downplay the severity of the incidents to the client to avoid panic or reputational damage. This is ethically unsound and potentially illegal, as it violates transparency obligations and could prevent the client from taking necessary steps to protect themselves and their own stakeholders. It erodes trust and can lead to severe legal and financial penalties. A third incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the vendor's self-reporting without independent verification. This abdicates responsibility for due diligence and could allow the true extent of the breach to remain hidden, exposing the client to ongoing risks and regulatory noncompliance. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Activating the incident response plan. 2. Gathering and preserving evidence. 3. Assessing the scope and impact of the incident. 4. Communicating transparently and promptly with all stakeholders, including legal counsel and regulatory bodies if required. 5. Implementing containment and eradication measures. 6. Conducting a post-incident review to identify lessons learned and improve future security posture. This systematic approach ensures that all legal, ethical, and professional obligations are met. Question 3. Compliance review shows that a recent penetration test identified several critical vulnerabilities within the organization's customer relationship management (CRM) system. The technical report details the specific exploits and their potential for data exfiltration. The Chief Information Security Officer (CISO) has requested a summary of the findings and recommended actions that can be understood by the Board of Directors, who have limited technical expertise but are focused on financial implications and operational continuity. Which of the following approaches best addresses this request while adhering to professional ethical standards for ethical hacking? Option A. Omit the most complex technical details and focus on a high-level overview of system security, assuring the board that the organization's defenses are generally robust. Option B. Present a prioritized list of vulnerabilities based on their potential impact on customer trust, financial losses due to data breaches, and operational disruption, along with cost-effective mitigation strategies tailored to each risk level. Option C. Focus on the number of critical vulnerabilities found, emphasizing the potential for system compromise and recommending immediate, broad-stroke security upgrades without specific prioritization. Option D. Provide a detailed technical breakdown of each vulnerability, including proof-of-concept exploits, and recommend the implementation of the most advanced security technologies available to address them. The correct answer is B. Present a prioritized list of vulnerabilities based on their potential impact on customer trust, financial losses due to data breaches, and operational disruption, along with cost-effective mitigation strategies tailored to each risk level. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in cybersecurity where a critical risk assessment has been conducted, but the findings are being presented to stakeholders who may not have a deep technical understanding. The difficulty lies in translating technical risks into business impact terms and ensuring that the proposed mitigation strategies are both effective and feasible within the organization's constraints. The ethical obligation is to provide accurate, actionable information that enables informed decision-making without causing undue alarm or misrepresenting the severity of the risks. Correct approach analysis. The most professional and ethically sound approach is to prioritize risks based on their potential business impact and likelihood of occurrence, and then to recommend mitigation strategies that are proportionate to the identified risks. This aligns with best practices in risk management, which emphasize a business-centric view of security. By focusing on the potential impact on critical business functions, data confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the ethical hacker can demonstrate the value of security investments and gain buy-in from management. This approach also implicitly adheres to the principle of due diligence, ensuring that resources are allocated effectively to address the most significant threats. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to focus solely on the technical severity of vulnerabilities without correlating them to business impact. This can lead to misallocation of resources, as a technically complex but low-impact vulnerability might receive undue attention, while a simpler but high-impact vulnerability is overlooked. This fails to meet the ethical obligation of providing actionable intelligence for business decision-making and can be seen as a failure of professional responsibility to communicate effectively. Another incorrect approach is to recommend overly aggressive or expensive mitigation strategies that are not justified by the risk assessment. This can lead to wasted resources and can erode trust with management if the proposed solutions are perceived as excessive or unnecessary. Ethically, this approach can be seen as a lack of professional integrity, potentially driven by a desire to implement complex solutions rather than the most practical and cost-effective ones. A third incorrect approach is to downplay or omit significant risks due to political pressure or a desire to avoid negative reporting. This is a clear ethical failure, as it compromises the integrity of the risk assessment and deprives stakeholders of crucial information needed to protect the organization. It violates the professional duty to be truthful and objective. Professional reasoning. When faced with a risk assessment that needs to be communicated to diverse stakeholders, a professional should employ a structured decision-making process. First, clearly define the scope and objectives of the assessment. Second, identify and analyze threats and vulnerabilities, quantifying their likelihood and potential impact on business operations. Third, prioritize risks based on a clear methodology, often using a risk matrix that considers both impact and likelihood. Fourth, develop a set of actionable and proportionate mitigation strategies. Finally, communicate the findings and recommendations in a clear, concise, and business-oriented manner, tailoring the message to the audience's technical understanding and business priorities. This process ensures that the assessment is not only technically sound, but also strategically valuable to the organization. Question 4. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a new intrusion detection system, IDs, offers a significant reduction in the likelihood of successful external attacks, but its data logging capabilities might inadvertently capture sensitive customer information not directly related to the attack. The organization operates under a strict data privacy regulatory framework, which approach best balances security enhancement with regulatory compliance and ethical considerations. Option A. Utilize the IDS's full logging capabilities to gather as much data as possible for future threat intelligence, assuming that the benefits of detailed logs outweigh potential privacy concerns. Option B. Implement the IDS with a robust data anonymization and filtering mechanism configured to exclude sensitive customer information from logs, even if this slightly reduces the IDS's forensic detail. Option C. Deploy the IDS immediately to maximize protection against external threats and address potential data capture issues through post-implementation audits and remediation. Option D. Delay the deployment of the IDS until a comprehensive legal review can be completed, potentially postponing security enhancements for an extended period. The correct answer is C. Deploy the IDS immediately to maximize protection against external threats and address potential data capture issues through post-implementation audits and remediation. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate, tangible benefits of a security solution against its long-term, often less quantifiable, risks and compliance implications. The ethical hacker must move beyond a purely technical assessment to consider the broader organizational impact, including potential legal ramifications and the erosion of trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the chosen approach aligns with both security best practices and the organization's legal and ethical obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive risk assessment that includes regulatory compliance. In the context of the Certified Ethical Hacker V12 exam, which implicitly operates within a framework that values responsible disclosure and adherence to legal boundaries, this approach ensures that any proposed security enhancement is not only effective, but also legally sound and ethically defensible. It demonstrates a commitment to protecting the organization within the established legal and ethical landscape, preventing potential fines, lawsuits, and reputational damage. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the technical efficacy of a solution without considering its broader implications is professionally unacceptable. Such an approach could lead to the implementation of tools or techniques that, while technically impressive, violate data privacy regulations, intellectual property laws, or contractual agreements. For instance, deploying a tool that inadvertently collects personally identifiable information without proper consent or anonymization would be a direct violation of data protection laws, leading to severe penalties and reputational harm. Another failure would be to overlook the potential for a solution to create new vulnerabilities or to be misused, thereby increasing the organization's overall risk profile, which is contrary to the core ethical duty of a security professional. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the organizational context, including its industry, regulatory environment, and risk tolerance. This is followed by a thorough technical evaluation of potential solutions, but critically, this evaluation must be integrated with a legal and ethical review. This review should consider applicable laws e.g., data privacy, cybersecurity regulations, industry standards, and the organization's own policies. Finally, a cost-benefit analysis should incorporate not just financial costs and technical benefits, but also the costs of non-compliance and the ethical benefits of a secure and trustworthy system. Question 5. The efficiency study reveals that the organization's incident response team is struggling to meet the mandated reporting timelines for data breaches, particularly when dealing with complex, multi-jurisdictional compromises. The team is considering a strategy to delay formal notification to regulatory bodies until a comprehensive forensic analysis can definitively attribute blame and quantify all potential damages, arguing this will provide a more complete picture for reporting. Option A. Submit a preliminary report to regulatory bodies that omits details about the extent of the compromise and potential attribution, with the intention of providing a more detailed report at a later stage. Option B. Immediately initiate the breach notification process to all relevant regulatory bodies and affected individuals as per legal requirements, while continuing the forensic investigation to provide supplementary details as they become available. Option C. Postpone all external notifications until the forensic investigation is fully completed, ensuring that the initial report to regulatory bodies is exhaustive and includes definitive attribution of blame and precise damage quantification. Option D. Notify only internal stakeholders and the legal department about the breach, and await further guidance before any external communication is considered. Correct answer is B. Immediately initiate the breach notification process to all relevant regulatory bodies and affected individuals as per legal requirements, while continuing the forensic investigation to provide supplementary details as they become available. Explanation: the efficiency study reveals a critical gap in the organization's incident response capabilities, specifically concerning the timely and accurate reporting of security breaches to regulatory bodies. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need to contain a breach with the legal and ethical obligations to inform affected parties and authorities within strict deadlines. The pressure to minimize reputational damage or operational disruption can tempt individuals to delay or obfuscate reporting, which carries severe consequences. The correct approach, which involves immediate notification to the relevant regulatory authority, in this case, assuming U.S. jurisdiction for the CEH v12 exam context. This would typically involve agencies like the FTC or state attorneys general, depending on the nature of the data compromised, and affected individuals as mandated by laws like the GDPR, if applicable to data subjects in the EU or state-specific breach notification laws, represents best professional practice. This adheres to the principle of transparency and accountability, which are cornerstones of cybersecurity ethics and legal compliance. Prompt reporting allows regulatory bodies to assess the situation, guide remediation efforts, and protect consumers, thereby fulfilling legal obligations and mitigating further harm. An incorrect approach of delaying notification until a full root cause analysis is complete fails to meet the statutory deadlines for breach reporting. This regulatory failure can result in significant fines, legal penalties, and loss of public trust. Ethically, it prioritizes the organization's convenience over the rights and safety of individuals whose data has been compromised. Another incorrect approach of only notifying internal stakeholders and not external regulatory bodies or affected individuals is a direct violation of breach notification laws. This constitutes a significant ethical lapse by withholding crucial information that individuals are legally entitled to receive, preventing them from taking necessary steps to protect themselves from identity theft or fraud. A further incorrect approach of selectively reporting only the most severe aspects of the breach while downplaying others is deceptive and unethical. This misrepresentation can mislead regulatory bodies and affected individuals, hindering effective response and potentially exacerbating the damage. It violates the ethical duty of honesty and integrity in professional conduct. Professionals facing such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical responsibility. This involves 1. Immediately activating the incident response plan, which should include predefined communication protocols for regulatory bodies and affected parties. 2. Consulting legal counsel to ensure all reporting is accurate, timely, and compliant with all applicable laws. 3. Documenting all actions taken, including reporting timelines and content, for audit and accountability purposes. 4. Prioritizing transparency and the protection of individuals' rights above all else, even when faced with internal pressures. Question 6. Stakeholder feedback indicates that during a recent penetration test, an ethical hacker discovered a critical zero-day vulnerability that could lead to a complete system compromise. The client's contract for penetration testing explicitly states that all findings must be reported directly to the client's Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, within 24 hours of discovery, and that no information is to be shared externally or publicly until the client has had 30 days to remediate. The ethical hacker is concerned that reporting this immediately might cause panic and significant disruption to the client's ongoing operations, and that the CISO might be difficult to reach due to a company-wide event. Which of the following actions best represents the ethical and professional approach for the ethical hacker? Option A. Contact the CISO direct assistant, explain the critical nature of the finding, and request an urgent meeting to discuss the vulnerability, providing a high-level summary of the risk without revealing technical details until the meeting. Option B. Inform the client's marketing department about the vulnerability, as they are responsible for public communications and can manage the fallout. Option C. Delay reporting the vulnerability until after the company-wide event concludes, hoping that the CISO will be more receptive to the news in a less stressful environment. Option D. Immediately publish a detailed technical write-up of the vulnerability on a public security forum to alert the wider community and pressure the client into faster action. The correct answer is D. Immediately publish a detailed technical write-up of the vulnerability on a public security forum to alert the wider community and pressure the client into faster action. Explanation. This scenario presents a common ethical dilemma in cybersecurity, specifically within the context of penetration testing and ethical hacking. The professional challenge lies in balancing the immediate need to report a critical vulnerability with the potential for causing significant disruption or reputational damage to the client if not handled with extreme care and adherence to agreed-upon protocols. The ethical hacker must navigate the client's expectations, contractual obligations, and the inherent risks associated with discovering and disclosing sensitive information. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the disclosure process is both effective in mitigating risk and responsible in its execution. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes clear communication, adherence to the established rules of engagement, and a phased disclosure process. By first informing the designated point of contact and providing a detailed, actionable report, the ethical hacker demonstrates professionalism and respect for the client's operational continuity. This aligns with ethical hacking principles that emphasize minimizing harm and maximizing benefit through responsible disclosure. The process allows the client to prepare for the remediation and public disclosure, thereby managing the impact. An incorrect approach that involves immediate public disclosure of the vulnerability without client consent or prior notification would be a significant ethical and professional failure. This action violates the trust established with the client, breaches confidentiality agreements, and could expose the organization to exploitation by malicious actors before they have a chance to fix the issue. It also disregards the agreed-upon reporting channels and timelines, demonstrating a lack of professionalism and potentially leading to legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach, such as withholding the information entirely due to fear of client reaction or potential negative consequences for the ethical hacker, is also professionally unacceptable. This failure to report a critical vulnerability puts the client's systems and data at severe risk, directly contradicting the purpose of the engagement. It represents a dereliction of duty and a breach of the ethical obligation to protect the client's interests. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the scope of work and rules of engagement before commencing any testing. During testing, if a critical vulnerability is discovered, the immediate priority is to document it thoroughly. The next step is to follow the agreed-upon communication protocol, typically involving notifying a designated client representative immediately. This notification should be followed by a detailed, non-technical summary of the risk, with a promise of a full technical report to follow. This phased approach allows the client to assess the severity and begin planning remediation, while the ethical hacker provides the necessary technical details. Throughout this process, maintaining confidentiality and acting with integrity are paramount. Question 7. Quality control measures reveal that during a penetration test, an ethical hacker discovers a misconfigured cloud storage bucket containing sensitive customer data. The initial scope of engagement focused solely on network infrastructure vulnerabilities and did not explicitly mention cloud configurations. The ethical hacker believes this misconfiguration poses a severe risk to the client's data confidentiality. Which of the following actions best represents the ethical and professional approach in this situation? Option A. Ignore the finding as it falls outside the explicitly defined scope of the penetration test. Option B. Report the finding directly to the cloud provider to have them rectify the misconfiguration, bypassing the client. Option C. Proceed to exploit the misconfiguration to demonstrate the full extent of the risk to the client. Assuming the client would want this identified, Option D. Immediately cease testing, document the finding, and request a formal scope amendment from the client to address the cloud misconfiguration before proceeding. The correct answer is D. Immediately cease testing, document the finding, and request a formal scope amendment from the client to address the cloud misconfiguration before proceeding. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking, balancing the need for thorough testing with the potential for unintended consequences and the legal/ethical boundaries of engagement. The professional challenge lies in interpreting the scope of authorization and understanding the implications of actions that might exceed or be misconstrued as exceeding that scope, even if performed with good intentions. Careful judgment is required to ensure all activities remain within the agreed-upon parameters and adhere to relevant legal and ethical standards. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes clear communication and adherence to the established rules of engagement. By seeking clarification and explicit authorization before proceeding with actions that could be interpreted as outside the scope, the ethical hacker demonstrates a commitment to operating within legal and ethical boundaries. This aligns with the principles of responsible disclosure and authorized penetration testing, ensuring that all activities are transparent and sanctioned by the client. This proactive communication prevents potential legal repercussions and maintains trust between the ethical hacker and the client. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding without explicit authorization, even if the intent is to identify a critical vulnerability, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It violates the principle of informed consent and could be construed as unauthorized access or malicious activity, leading to legal penalties and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, such as immediately reporting the finding to a third party without informing the client, breaches confidentiality agreements and the ethical obligation to disclose findings directly to the authorized party first. This can jeopardize the client's security posture and create an adversarial relationship. A third incorrect approach, such as ignoring the finding due to perceived ambiguity in the scope, fails to uphold the ethical responsibility to identify and report potential security risks, even if they fall into a gray area, as it leaves the client vulnerable. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the scope of engagement and the client's explicit authorization. When encountering ambiguity or potential scope creep, the immediate step should be to pause, document the observation, and seek clarification from the designated point of contact. This communication should be clear, concise, and focused on the potential impact and the need for authorization. If authorization is granted, proceed with documented approval. If denied, respect the decision and continue within the defined scope. If a critical finding is discovered that appears to be outside the immediate scope but poses a significant risk, the ethical approach is to report it to the client for their decision on how to proceed, rather than acting unilaterally. Question 8. Assessment of the most appropriate methodology for conducting a penetration test on a live, critical financial transaction processing system, where the primary objective is to identify vulnerabilities without causing service disruption or data loss, and where the testing window is limited. Option A. Focus exclusively on passive information gathering and analysis, avoiding any active testing that could potentially trigger intrusion detection systems or impact system performance. Option B. Immediately initiate aggressive exploitation techniques to uncover the most critical vulnerabilities as quickly as possible, assuming the system is designed to withstand such attempts. Option C. Conduct a phased assessment, beginning with reconnaissance and vulnerability scanning, followed by controlled exploitation attempts after obtaining explicit approval for each significant test, and maintaining continuous communication with the client's IT operations team. Option D. Proceed with a full-spectrum penetration test, including denial of service simulations, to gauge the system's resilience under extreme load, without prior notification to the client to maintain the element of surprise. The correct answer is C. Conduct a phased assessment, beginning with reconnaissance and vulnerability scanning, followed by controlled exploitation attempts after obtaining explicit approval for each significant test, and maintaining continuous communication with the client's IT operations team. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking, balancing the need for comprehensive testing with the potential for unintended disruption and the obligation to maintain confidentiality. The professional is tasked with identifying vulnerabilities in a critical system that supports daily operations. The challenge lies in determining the most responsible and effective method for conducting the assessment without causing harm or breaching trust. The correct approach prioritizes a structured, phased methodology that emphasizes communication, risk mitigation, and adherence to established protocols. This aligns with best professional practices by ensuring that all stakeholders are informed, potential impacts are assessed, and the testing is conducted within agreed-upon boundaries. Specifically, it reflects the ethical hacker's duty to act with integrity, competence, and in a manner that minimizes harm. This approach is further reinforced by the implicit understanding within professional ethical hacking frameworks that unauthorized access or disruption is unacceptable, and that all activities must be authorized and controlled. An incorrect approach that immediately proceeds with intrusive testing without prior authorization or a clear understanding of the system's criticality fails to uphold professional ethics and regulatory expectations. Such an action could be construed as unauthorized access, even if the intent is benign, leading to legal repercussions and a severe breach of trust. Another incorrect approach, focusing solely on technical discovery without considering the business impact or communication, demonstrates a lack of holistic risk management. This neglects the ethical obligation to consider the consequences of one's actions on the organization. Finally, an approach that delays testing indefinitely due to fear of disruption, without proposing alternative risk-mitigated strategies, fails to meet the professional obligation to provide a valuable security assessment. It demonstrates a lack of initiative and an inability to manage risk effectively. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the scope, objectives, and constraints of the engagement. This includes identifying all relevant stakeholders, understanding the criticality of the systems involved, and establishing clear communication channels. Risk assessment and mitigation planning should be integral to this process, ensuring that potential impacts are identified and addressed before any testing commences. A phased approach, starting with less intrusive methods and escalating only with explicit consent and careful monitoring, is a hallmark of responsible ethical hacking. Question 9. Comparative studies suggest that ethical hackers often face situations where they discover sensitive, unencrypted data during a penetration test that was not the primary target of the engagement. In such a scenario, what is the most professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Attempt to access and extract the sensitive data to a secure location for analysis and remediation, as this demonstrates proactive security measures. Option B. Attempt to encrypt the sensitive data in place to mitigate immediate risk without informing the client, to avoid causing undue alarm. Option C. Immediately cease the current testing activities, secure the discovered sensitive data to prevent further exposure, and promptly notify the client of the findings and the need for immediate remediation. Option D. Continue with the original penetration testing objectives, documenting the discovery of sensitive data for a later report, as the primary scope was not to find such vulnerabilities. Correct answer is C. Immediately cease the current testing activities, secure the discovered sensitive data to prevent further exposure, and promptly notify the client of the findings and the need for immediate remediation. Explanation. This scenario presents a common ethical dilemma for ethical hackers, balancing the immediate need for information with the potential for causing unintended harm or violating privacy. The challenge lies in making a judgment call under pressure, where the perceived benefit of rapid access to critical data must be weighed against the risks of unauthorized access and potential data exfiltration, even if the intent is benign. The certified ethical hacker, say, is expected to operate within a defined ethical and legal framework, prioritizing responsible disclosure and minimizing collateral damage. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it adheres to the core principles of ethical hacking and cybersecurity regulations. It prioritizes containment and notification, which are crucial for incident response and legal compliance. By immediately informing the client and following established protocols, the ethical hacker demonstrates integrity and professionalism. This aligns with the general principles of responsible disclosure and the need to maintain client trust, which are implicitly supported by cybersecurity best practices and the ethical codes governing the profession. While specific U.S. regulations like HIPAA or GDPR might not be directly cited in the CEH exam's general framework, the underlying principles of data protection and authorized access are universally applicable and form the basis of ethical conduct. An incorrect approach that involves immediately attempting to access and extract the sensitive data, even with the intent to secure it, represents a significant ethical and potentially legal failure. This action bypasses established client communication channels and authorization procedures, constituting unauthorized access and potential data exfiltration, which is a violation of trust and could have severe legal ramifications under various data protection laws. Another incorrect approach, such as ignoring the sensitive data and proceeding with the planned penetration test, demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to recognize a critical security incident. This negligence could lead to further compromise or exploitation of the sensitive data by malicious actors, resulting in significant harm to the client and potential liability. A third incorrect approach, such as attempting to neutralize the threat without informing the client, risks overstepping boundaries, and could lead to unintended consequences or misinterpretations of the situation, potentially causing more harm than good and violating the principle of client-centric operations. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with immediate threat assessment and containment, followed by clear and prompt communication with the client. This framework emphasizes adherence to predefined incident response plans and ethical guidelines, ensuring that all actions are authorized, documented, and proportionate to the identified risks. The CEH should always operate with a mindset of do no harm and prioritize transparency and client collaboration. Question 10. Governance review demonstrates that an ethical hacker has identified a vulnerability in a web application that, on its own, does not directly lead to sensitive data exfiltration. However, the hacker recognizes that this vulnerability could be chained with another, less severe vulnerability to achieve a full compromise. The engagement contract strictly defines the scope of testing and prohibits any actions that could disrupt services or access data beyond what is explicitly permitted. What is the most appropriate course of action for the ethical hacker? Option A. Ignore the vulnerability as it does not directly lead to data exfiltration within the current testing parameters. Option B. Perform further unauthorized actions to demonstrate the full exploit chain and its potential impact. Option C. Report the vulnerability without any context or potential impact analysis to the client. Option D. Document the vulnerability, its potential impact in a chained attack scenario, and recommend remediation to the client. The correct answer is D. Document the vulnerability, its potential impact in a chained attack scenario, and recommend remediation to the client. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking where a discovered vulnerability, while not directly exploitable for immediate data exfiltration, could be leveraged in a multi-stage attack. The ethical hacker must balance the immediate risk of the vulnerability against the potential for future, more severe compromise. The professional challenge lies in accurately assessing the risk, communicating it effectively to stakeholders, and recommending appropriate remediation without overstating or understating the threat, all while adhering to the defined scope of engagement and legal/regulatory boundaries. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves documenting the vulnerability, its potential impact in a chained attack scenario, and recommending remediation. This aligns with the ethical hacking principle of responsible disclosure and the need to provide actionable intelligence to the client. In the context of the CEH v12 exam's implied U.S. regulatory framework, as it's a U.S.-based certification, this approach is consistent with best practices that emphasize risk management and proactive security measures. It respects the client's systems by not performing actions that exceed the agreed-upon scope, while still fulfilling the ethical obligation to report potential threats. The focus is on providing information for informed decision-making by the client. Incorrect approach is analysis. Performing further unauthorized actions to demonstrate the full exploit chain would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It violates the principle of operating within the defined scope of the engagement, potentially breaching laws related to unauthorized access and computer misuse. This action could lead to legal repercussions for the ethical hacker and their organization and damage client trust. Ignoring the vulnerability because it doesn't directly lead to data exfiltration is also an ethical failure. It demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to uphold the duty of care to the client. While not a direct legal breach in itself, it neglects the responsibility to identify and report potential security weaknesses that could be exploited by malicious actors. This can lead to future breaches for which the ethical hacker might be indirectly held accountable for not reporting. Reporting the vulnerability without any context or potential impact analysis is insufficient. While it fulfills the basic requirement of reporting, it fails to provide the client with the necessary information to prioritize remediation efforts. This can lead to the vulnerability being overlooked or deprioritized, ultimately increasing the client's risk exposure. It falls short of the professional standard of providing comprehensive and actionable security assessments. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach. First, clearly understand and adhere to the scope of the engagement. Second, meticulously document all findings, including potential attack vectors and their implications, even if they require multiple steps. Third, Communicate these findings clearly and concisely to the client, emphasizing the potential impact and recommending appropriate remediation strategies. Finally, always seek explicit authorization before performing any action that falls outside the agreed-upon scope. This systematic process ensures legal compliance, ethical conduct, and the delivery of valuable security insights. Question 11. To address the challenge of discovering sensitive customer personally identifiable information, PI, on a server that was explicitly excluded from the scope of a penetration testing engagement, what is the most appropriate immediate course of action for a certified ethical hacker? Option A. Immediately begin a deeper investigation into the PII to understand the extent of the exposure and potential impact, as this is a critical security finding. Option B. Ignore the discovery as it falls outside the agreed-upon scope of the penetration test and continue with the authorized testing activities. Option C. Immediately report the PII discovery to relevant data protection authorities without informing the client first to ensure compliance. Option D. Document the discovery, immediately notify the client's primary point of contact about the finding and its location, and await further instructions regarding whether to investigate further or report it. The correct answer is D. Document the discovery, immediately notify the client's primary point of contact about the finding and its location, and await further instructions regarding whether to investigate further or report it. Explanation. The scenario presents a common ethical dilemma in penetration testing, discovering sensitive data that falls outside the agreed-upon scope of the engagement. Professional challenge lies in balancing the client's explicit instructions with the ethical obligation to report potentially critical vulnerabilities and data exposures. The certified ethical hacker, say, must navigate this by adhering strictly to the established rules of engagement (RO), while also recognizing the broader implications of their findings. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing adherence to the ROE. This upholds the contractual agreement and trust between the tester and the client. Reporting the discovery through the designated channels, even if it's outside the scope, is crucial. This allows the client to make an informed decision about how to proceed, respecting their ownership of the data and their authority to authorize further investigation or remediation. This aligns with ethical principles of honesty, integrity, and professional responsibility, ensuring that the client is aware of potential risks without the tester overstepping their authority. An incorrect approach of immediately investigating the sensitive data further, even with good intentions, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It violates the ROE, which defines the boundaries of the engagement. This unauthorized access, even if for the client's benefit, could be construed as a breach of contract and potentially illegal activity, undermining the legitimacy of the entire penetration test. It also bypasses the client's decision-making process, treating them as incapable of managing their own data security. Another incorrect approach of ignoring the discovery entirely is also a critical ethical failure. While it adheres to the letter of the ROE by not actively investigating outside the scope, it neglects the ethical duty to report significant findings that could harm the client or their stakeholders. This inaction can lead to severe consequences for the client if the vulnerability is exploited, and the ethical professional is complicit in the potential damage by not raising awareness. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and professional responsibility. Finally, an incorrect approach of immediately disclosing the sensitive data to external parties or authorities without the client's explicit consent is a severe breach of confidentiality and trust. This violates privacy regulations and the fundamental principles of ethical hacking, which mandate discretion and client-centric reporting. Such an action could lead to legal repercussions for both the tester and the client, and irrevocably damage the professional's reputation. The professional reasoning process in such situations should involve 1. Strict adherence to the ROE as the primary guide. 2. Documenting the discovery accurately and objectively. 3. Immediately and discreetly informing the designated point of contact within the client organization about the discovery, clearly stating it is outside the agreed scope. 4. Awaiting explicit instructions from the client on how to proceed, offering assistance within the revised scope if authorized. 5. Maintaining strict confidentiality throughout the process. Question 12. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a client's external web application is vulnerable to a specific type of injection attack. The engagement letter grants broad authorization to test the external web application for vulnerabilities. However, It does not explicitly mention testing for specific attack vectors or accessing specific types of sensitive data that might be exposed by such an attack. The ethical hacker discovers that exploiting this vulnerability could potentially expose customer personally identifiable information, PI, stored in a backend database that is not directly accessible via the web application, but is linked to it. Which of the following actions best represents the ethical and legally compliant approach for the ethical hacker in this scenario? Option A. Document the vulnerability and its potential to expose PII, but do not attempt to exploit it further or access the database, as the engagement letter does not explicitly authorize access to backend systems or specific data types. Option B. Immediately cease all testing related to this vulnerability and report the potential exposure of PII to the client, requesting explicit written authorization to proceed with further exploitation to demonstrate the impact. Option C. Attempt to access the backend database to confirm the PII exposure, assuming that demonstrating the full risk is implied within the broad authorization to test the external web application. Option D. Proceed with exploiting the vulnerability to demonstrate the full impact of the exposure, including accessing the PII, as the engagement letter provides broad authorization for testing the external web application. Correct answer is D. Proceed with exploiting the vulnerability to demonstrate the full impact of the exposure, including accessing the PII, as the engagement letter provides broad authorization for testing the external web application. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking, balancing the need for thorough testing with the imperative to comply with legal and regulatory frameworks. The professional must navigate the potential for unintended consequences and ensure that all actions are authorized and within the scope of the engagement. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting the scope of authorization and understanding the boundaries of acceptable testing activities, especially when dealing with sensitive data or critical infrastructure. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing explicit authorization and adherence to established legal and ethical guidelines. This aligns with the principles of responsible disclosure and the ethical hacker's duty to operate within legal boundaries. Specifically, it reflects the requirement to obtain clear, written consent for all testing activities, ensuring that the scope is well-defined and understood by all parties. This proactive approach minimizes legal risks and maintains the integrity of the engagement. An incorrect approach that involves testing systems or data not explicitly covered by the authorization constitutes a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to violations of data privacy laws, unauthorized access charges, and breaches of contract. It demonstrates a disregard for the client's explicit instructions and a failure to uphold professional standards. Another incorrect approach, such as relying on assumptions about implied consent or the permissibility of certain actions, is equally problematic. It bypasses the critical step of formal agreement and can result in legal repercussions and damage to professional reputation. The failure to document all communications and agreements also represents a lapse in professional diligence, making it difficult to prove authorization if challenged. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough review of the engagement contract and any accompanying legal documentation. This includes clearly defining the scope of work, authorized targets, permitted testing methodologies, and reporting requirements. Any ambiguity should be immediately clarified with the client through formal, documented communication. Before commencing any testing, a formal authorization document, signed by an authorized representative of the client, must be obtained. Throughout the engagement, professionals must continuously assess their actions against the agreed-upon scope and legal constraints, and any deviation or discovery of new vulnerabilities outside the scope should be reported to the client for further authorization before proceeding. Question 13. Governance review demonstrates that a critical vulnerability has been identified in a widely used third-party application integral to the organization's core operations. The vulnerability is known to be actively exploited in the wild, posing an immediate and significant risk of data exfiltration and system compromise. The vendor has released a patch, but it has not yet undergone internal testing for compatibility or potential side effects within the organization's specific environment. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action? Option A. Attempt to manually remediate the vulnerability by implementing custom security configurations on affected systems without applying the vendor patch to avoid potential compatibility issues. Option B. Halt all operations on systems utilizing the vulnerable application until a comprehensive, in-depth security audit of the application and the patch can be completed. Option C. Initiate an immediate, albeit expedited, risk assessment to understand the potential impact of the vulnerability and the patch, and then seek management approval for a controlled deployment of the patch. Option D. Immediately deploy the vendor-provided patch to all affected systems to mitigate the risk of exploitation, and then conduct post-deployment testing and validation. The correct answer is D. Immediately deploy the vendor-provided patch to all affected systems to mitigate the risk of exploitation, and then conduct post-deployment testing and validation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in cybersecurity where a newly discovered vulnerability in a critical system requires immediate attention. The professional ethical obligation is to protect the organization's assets and data while also adhering to legal and regulatory frameworks. The challenge lies in balancing the urgency of remediation with the need for proper authorization, risk assessment, and communication, especially when dealing with potentially sensitive data or systems that impact external parties. The ethical dilemma arises from the potential for harm if the vulnerability is exploited versus the potential disruption or compliance issues caused by an unauthorized or poorly executed remediation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a structured, risk-based response that prioritizes immediate containment and then moves to thorough assessment and remediation, all while maintaining transparency and seeking appropriate authorization. This aligns with the principles of responsible disclosure and incident response mandated by various cybersecurity frameworks and ethical codes. Specifically, it emphasizes the need to 1. Immediately contain the threat to prevent further compromise. 2. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to understand the potential impact. 3. Develop and test a remediation plan. And 4. Obtain necessary approvals before implementing the fix. This methodical process ensures that the organization acts diligently and responsibly, minimizing both the security risk and the potential for unintended consequences. It reflects best practices in incident response and governance, aiming to restore the system to a secure state efficiently and effectively. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately applying a patch without proper testing or authorization. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it bypasses essential risk management processes. Unforeseen side effects of a patch could destabilize the system, cause data loss, or even introduce new vulnerabilities, leading to greater harm than the original exploit. This violates the principle of due diligence and could contravene internal policies and potentially external compliance requirements that mandate controlled change management. Another incorrect approach is to delay any action until a full, formal risk assessment is completed, even if the vulnerability is known to be critical and actively exploited. This is a significant ethical and potentially regulatory failure. The duty of care requires prompt action to protect assets and data. Prolonged inaction in the face of a known, exploitable threat constitutes negligence and a breach of trust, exposing the organization to significant liability and reputational damage. It fails to meet the standard of reasonable security practices expected of an organization. A third incorrect approach is to attempt to fix the vulnerability without informing relevant stakeholders or seeking management approval. This is a breach of governance and ethical conduct. Cybersecurity professionals operate within an organizational structure that requires accountability and transparency. Unauthorized actions, even with good intentions, can lead to miscommunication, conflicting efforts, and a lack of oversight, potentially exacerbating the problem or creating new compliance issues. It undermines the established governance framework and the principle of informed decision-making. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a scenario should employ a structured incident response framework. This typically involves phases such as preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and lessons learned. The decision-making process should be guided by a risk assessment matrix, organizational policies, and relevant legal and regulatory obligations. Prioritization should be based on the severity of the threat, the potential impact on the organization, and the likelihood of exploitation. Communication with relevant stakeholders, including management, legal counsel, and potentially regulatory bodies, is paramount throughout the process. Ethical considerations, such as the duty to protect data and systems, should always be at the forefront. Question 14. The performance metrics show a 30% increase in phishing-related security incidents targeting customer accounts within the last quarter. As a cybersecurity analyst for a U.S.-based financial institution, what is the most appropriate immediate action to take, considering the regulatory landscape? Option A. Inform the public via a press release about the increase in phishing attempts and advise customers to change their passwords without conducting a detailed investigation to avoid causing panic. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive forensic investigation to identify the attack vectors, affected systems, and compromised data, while simultaneously notifying the legal and compliance departments to prepare for potential regulatory reporting obligations under frameworks like GLBA and state-specific data breach notification laws. Option C. Conduct a quick scan of all customer databases for any signs of unauthorized access, and if none are found, consider the incidents contained and proceed with standard security awareness training updates. Option D. Immediately deploy a company-wide email filter to block all external emails containing suspicious keywords, and instruct all employees to refrain from opening any emails until further notice. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive forensic investigation to identify the attack vectors, affected systems, and compromised data, while simultaneously notifying the legal and compliance departments to prepare for potential regulatory reporting obligations under frameworks like GLBA and state-specific data breach notification laws. Explanation. The performance metrics show a significant increase in reported security incidents within a financial institution. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a rapid and accurate assessment of the situation to determine the appropriate response, balancing the need for immediate action with the imperative to comply with stringent regulatory frameworks governing financial data and cybersecurity. The ethical obligation to protect customer data and maintain trust is paramount, while legal requirements dictate specific reporting timelines and data breach notification procedures. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented investigation that prioritizes data integrity and regulatory adherence. This includes immediately isolating affected systems, preserving evidence for forensic analysis, and consulting with legal and compliance teams to ensure all actions align with relevant regulations. The ethical imperative to protect sensitive financial information and the legal requirement to report breaches within prescribed timeframes necessitate a measured yet decisive response. This approach demonstrates due diligence, upholds professional integrity, and minimizes potential legal and reputational damage. An incorrect approach would be to immediately implement widespread system shutdowns without proper forensic analysis. This could lead to the destruction of crucial evidence, hindering the investigation and potentially violating regulations that require evidence preservation. Another incorrect approach is to delay reporting to regulatory bodies or affected individuals, which directly contravenes legal obligations and erodes trust. Furthermore, attempting to remediate vulnerabilities without a thorough understanding of the attack vector risks introducing new security flaws or failing to address the root cause, leading to recurring incidents and further regulatory scrutiny. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with incident identification and classification, followed by containment, eradication, and recovery. Throughout this process, continuous communication with stakeholders, including legal, compliance, and executive leadership, is vital. A key element is the proactive engagement with regulatory requirements, ensuring that all actions are documented and justifiable under the applicable legal and ethical standards. This structured approach ensures that the response is both effective in mitigating the current threat and compliant with all governing frameworks. Question 15. Consider a scenario where during a penetration test of a web application, an ethical hacker discovers a critical SQL injection vulnerability. While confirming the vulnerability, they inadvertently gain access to a database table containing sensitive customer personally identifiable information, PI. The scope of the engagement explicitly prohibits the exfiltration of any data. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the ethical hacker? Option A. Download a sample of the PII to demonstrate the severity of the vulnerability to the client, as this will ensure they understand the risk. Option B. Continue to explore the database to identify other sensitive data that might be at risk to provide a more comprehensive risk assessment to the client. Option C. Ignore the SQL injection vulnerability for now and focus on other areas of the application as per the original test plan to avoid exceeding the scope. Option D. Immediately cease all data access, document the vulnerability and the inadvertent access, and report the finding to the client without further data extraction. Correct answer is D. Immediately cease all data access, document the vulnerability and the inadvertent access, and report the finding to the client without further data extraction. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking, balancing the need for comprehensive testing with the imperative to avoid unauthorized access or data exfiltration. The ethical hacker must operate within the strict confines of their authorization, ensuring that their actions do not inadvertently cross legal or contractual boundaries. The difficulty lies in the potential for discovery of vulnerabilities that, while exploitable, fall outside the agreed-upon scope of the penetration test. This requires a nuanced understanding of authorization limits and a commitment to reporting findings responsibly. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves meticulously documenting the vulnerability and immediately ceasing any further exploitation or data access beyond what is strictly necessary to confirm the vulnerability existence and impact. This aligns with the core principles of ethical hacking and regulatory compliance, particularly within frameworks like the U.S. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA, and general ethical hacking methodologies. The ethical hacker's authorization is limited to testing for vulnerabilities, not to exploiting them for personal gain or unauthorized data access. Reporting the finding promptly to the client, along with detailed evidence of the vulnerability and its potential impact, is paramount. This ensures the client is informed and can take appropriate remediation steps, while the ethical hacker remains within legal and ethical boundaries. This approach upholds the trust placed in the ethical hacker and demonstrates professional integrity. Incorrect approach is analysis. Continuing to explore the compromised system beyond the scope of confirming the vulnerability, even with good intentions like identifying further risks, constitutes unauthorized access and potential data exfiltration. This directly violates the CFA and any contractual agreements, exposing the ethical hacker to legal repercussions and damaging their professional reputation. Such actions blur the line between ethical testing and malicious activity. Attempting to exploit the vulnerability further to gain deeper access or extract sensitive information, even if for the purpose of demonstrating the severity of the risk, is a clear breach of authorization and a violation of privacy laws. This moves beyond testing into unauthorized access and potential data theft, which are illegal and unethical. Ignoring the vulnerability and proceeding with the rest of the penetration test without reporting it is also a failure. While it avoids immediate unauthorized access, it fails to fulfill the ethical hacker's duty to report discovered risks to the client. This negligence can have severe consequences for the client if the vulnerability is later exploited by malicious actors. It also undermines the purpose of the engagement and the trust inherent in the client-hacker relationship. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a report and contain mindset. Upon discovering a vulnerability that extends beyond the authorized scope, the immediate professional decision-making process involves 1. Cease all actions that could be construed as unauthorized access or data exfiltration. 2. Document the discovery meticulously, including steps taken to confirm the vulnerability and any evidence gathered, without exfiltrating sensitive data. 3. Immediately report the finding to the designated point of contact within the client organization, clearly outlining the nature of the vulnerability and its potential impact. 4. Seek explicit authorization for any further actions beyond initial confirmation, if deemed necessary by the client. 5. Adhere strictly to the agreed-upon scope of work and any predefined incident response protocols. This structured approach ensures that the ethical hacker operates within legal and ethical boundaries, maintains client trust, and effectively fulfills their professional obligations. Question 16. The investigation demonstrates that during a penetration test, an ethical hacker discovered a critical vulnerability, allowing access to sensitive customer PII. The client's authorization explicitly permits testing for vulnerabilities, but does not specifically mention data exfiltration or the handling of PII. The ethical hacker is considering how to best demonstrate the severity of this vulnerability to the client. Which of the following actions best represents a professionally responsible and legally compliant approach to demonstrating the vulnerability? Option A. The ethical hacker should download a sample of the PII to present to the client as undeniable proof of the vulnerability impact. Option B. The ethical hacker should document the vulnerability with screenshots and detailed technical explanations of how PII could be accessed, without actually downloading or manipulating any PII. Option C. The ethical hacker should attempt to exploit the vulnerability further to gain administrative access to the entire customer database, proving the ultimate risk. Option D. The ethical hacker should immediately inform the client's legal department about the PII exposure and await their instructions on how to proceed. The correct answer is B. The ethical hacker should document the vulnerability with screenshots and detailed technical explanations of how PII could be accessed, without actually downloading or manipulating any PII. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a common challenge in ethical hacking, balancing the need for thorough evidence gathering with the imperative to adhere strictly to legal and regulatory boundaries. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that the methods employed during a penetration test, even when authorized, do not inadvertently cross into illegal activities or violate privacy laws, which could invalidate the findings and lead to severe legal repercussions for the ethical hacker and their client. Careful judgment is required to interpret the scope of authorization and to understand the potential impact of each action on data privacy and system integrity. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes actions that are explicitly within the agreed-upon scope of the penetration test and are conducted in a manner that minimizes data exposure and respects privacy. This aligns with the ethical hacker's responsibility to operate within legal frameworks and to avoid actions that could be construed as unauthorized access or data theft, even if the intent is to identify vulnerabilities. Adherence to the client's explicit instructions and the relevant regulatory guidelines, such as those pertaining to data protection and privacy, is paramount. An incorrect approach that involves accessing or exfiltrating sensitive client data, even if discovered as a vulnerability, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could violate data protection laws, such as the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, if applicable to the client's data, or other privacy statutes, by exceeding the authorized scope of the test and engaging in unauthorized data handling. Another incorrect approach, such as deliberately causing system disruption beyond what is necessary to demonstrate a vulnerability, could lead to legal liability for damages and a breach of professional conduct, potentially violating service-level agreements and client trust. Furthermore, failing to document findings meticulously and report them through established channels, instead opting for informal or unauthorized disclosure, undermines the integrity of the assessment and can lead to misinterpretations or misuse of the information, violating professional reporting standards and potentially client confidentiality agreements. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding and written confirmation of the authorized scope of work. This framework involves continuous risk assessment throughout the engagement, evaluating each potential action against legal requirements, ethical guidelines, and client directives. If any action carries a significant risk of violating regulations or exceeding authorization, it should be escalated to the client for clarification or approval before proceeding. The principle of least privilege should guide all actions, ensuring that only the minimum necessary access and actions are taken to achieve the testing objectives. Question 17. Upon reviewing the scope of work for a penetration testing engagement, a security consultant discovers a potential vulnerability in a system that is explicitly excluded from the authorized testing parameters. The consultant believes that testing this excluded system could provide significant value to the client by highlighting a critical security gap. However, the engagement letter clearly states that testing is limited to specific IP ranges and systems. Which of the following actions best aligns with regulatory compliance and ethical professional conduct in this scenario? Option A. Immediately cease any further testing on the excluded system and formally request written authorization from the client to include it in the scope of work before proceeding. Option B. Proceed with testing the excluded system, documenting the findings, and informing the client of the discovery and the unauthorized testing after the fact. Option C. Assume that the client would want this critical vulnerability identified and proceed with testing, as the potential benefit outweighs the minor deviation from the scope. Option D. Conduct a limited, non-intrusive scan of the excluded system to gather preliminary information and then decide whether to seek authorization based on the findings. The correct answer is B. Proceed with testing the excluded system, documenting the findings, and informing the client of the discovery and the unauthorized testing after the fact. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking, balancing the need for comprehensive testing with the imperative to adhere to legal and regulatory boundaries. The professional is tasked with identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited, but the scope of their actions is strictly defined by the engagement agreement and applicable laws. Misinterpreting or exceeding these boundaries can lead to severe legal repercussions, reputational damage, and a breach of trust with the client. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all testing activities remain within the agreed-upon scope and comply with relevant regulations, preventing unintended consequences. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes explicit authorization and adherence to the defined scope of work. This aligns directly with the principles of responsible and ethical hacking, as well as the legal requirements of operating within a defined engagement. By seeking clarification and ensuring all actions are documented and approved, a professional demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to operating within legal and ethical frameworks. This proactive communication and adherence to scope prevent potential legal liabilities and maintain the integrity of the engagement. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with testing outside the agreed-upon scope, even if it appears to be for the client's benefit, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This action constitutes unauthorized access and could be construed as a violation of computer misuse laws, depending on the jurisdiction. Ethically, it breaches the trust established in the engagement agreement and demonstrates a disregard for the client's explicit instructions and boundaries. Another incorrect approach, such as assuming implied consent for testing beyond the defined scope, is also a critical failure. Legal and ethical frameworks require explicit consent for any penetration testing activities. Relying on assumptions or broad interpretations of general security needs can lead to unintended consequences and legal challenges. This approach demonstrates a lack of professionalism and a failure to understand the importance of clear, documented authorization. Finally, an incorrect approach that involves conducting tests that are explicitly prohibited by the client or regulatory guidelines, regardless of their perceived value, is a direct violation of professional conduct and legal statutes. This demonstrates a reckless disregard for the client's wishes and the established rules of engagement, potentially leading to severe legal penalties and a complete breakdown of the professional relationship. Professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the engagement scope, explicit client authorization for all testing activities, and a commitment to adhering strictly to these boundaries. When in doubt, seeking clarification from the client or legal counsel is paramount. Documenting all communications, approvals, and testing methodologies is crucial for demonstrating compliance and protecting oneself and the client. A risk-based approach that prioritizes legal and ethical compliance over potentially unauthorized but seemingly beneficial actions is essential for maintaining professional integrity. Question 18. Stakeholder feedback indicates that the current risk assessment process is perceived as overly theoretical and not directly translating into actionable security improvements. As an ethical hacker tasked with reevaluating this process, which of the following approaches would best address these concerns while adhering to professional ethical standards and common cybersecurity best practices? Option A. Adopt a purely compliance-driven risk assessment framework, focusing solely on meeting the minimum requirements of relevant industry regulations without considering unique organizational risks. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive scan of all network devices and applications to identify every possible technical vulnerability, regardless of its potential impact on business operations. Option C. Implement a phased risk assessment methodology that begins with identifying critical business assets and processes, followed by an analysis of threats and vulnerabilities relevant to those assets, and then prioritizes risks based on their potential business impact and likelihood of occurrence. Option D. Expand the scope of the risk assessment to include every conceivable threat vector and potential risk scenario, even those with extremely low probability and impact, to ensure absolute coverage. Correct answer is C. Implement a phased risk assessment methodology that begins with identifying critical business assets and processes, followed by an analysis of threats and vulnerabilities relevant to those assets, and then prioritizes risks based on their potential business impact and likelihood of occurrence. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking, balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical constraints of time and resources, while adhering to established ethical and professional standards. The core difficulty lies in ensuring that the assessment accurately reflects the organization's actual risk posture without becoming an insurmountable project. Professional judgment is required to prioritize efforts and select methodologies that yield actionable insights within these limitations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of a structured and iterative risk assessment process, as often mandated or implied by cybersecurity frameworks and ethical guidelines relevant to professional certifications like CEH. It emphasizes understanding the business context and prioritizing threats based on their potential impact and likelihood, which is crucial for effective risk management. This method ensures that the assessment is not merely a technical exercise, but a strategic tool for improving the organization's security posture. It also implicitly supports compliance with general data protection and security regulations by focusing on identifying and mitigating significant risks. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on technical vulnerabilities without considering business impact fails to provide a holistic view of risk. This can lead to misallocation of resources, addressing low-impact vulnerabilities while ignoring critical business risks. Ethically, this is a failure to serve the client's best interests by not providing a complete picture of their security landscape. It also risks violating professional standards that require a business-aware approach to security. Another incorrect approach that relies on outdated or overly simplistic risk models neglects the dynamic nature of threats and the evolving business environment. This can result in an inaccurate assessment that does not reflect current risks, potentially leaving the organization exposed. From a regulatory and ethical standpoint, this demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to maintain professional competence, as it does not employ current best practices in risk assessment. A further incorrect approach that prioritizes breadth over depth, attempting to cover every conceivable risk without sufficient detail, can lead to superficial findings. While it might appear comprehensive, it often lacks the actionable intelligence needed for effective remediation. This can be seen as a failure to deliver value, as the assessment does not provide the clarity required for informed decision-making, potentially leading to wasted effort and resources. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the client's objectives and risk appetite. This includes defining the scope of the assessment collaboratively, selecting appropriate methodologies that balance detail with practicality, and prioritizing findings based on their potential impact on the organization's critical assets and operations. Continuous communication with stakeholders throughout the process is vital to ensure alignment and manage expectations. Question 19. Examination of the data shows that client has requested a comprehensive risk assessment of their internal network. The ethical hacker has been provided with a broad authorization to assess security. To begin the assessment, the ethical hacker needs to understand the network's architecture and identify potential vulnerabilities. Which of the following approaches is the most ethically sound and professionally appropriate for initiating this risk assessment? Option A. Initiate a broad, unauthorized passive information gathering campaign on the internet to collect any data related to the client's digital footprint, assuming this is implicitly part of understanding their overall risk. Option B. Begin conducting social engineering tests against employees to gauge their security awareness, without obtaining specific, documented consent for each individual test. Option C. Conduct authorized network reconnaissance and vulnerability scanning, using tools and techniques explicitly permitted by the client's authorization, focusing on identifying publicly accessible services and known weaknesses. Option D. Attempt to exploit identified vulnerabilities on the internal network immediately to demonstrate the severity of the risks, without further explicit permission for exploitation. Correct answer is C. Conduct authorized network reconnaissance and vulnerability scanning using tools and techniques explicitly permitted by the client's authorization, focusing on identifying publicly accessible services and known weaknesses. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking, balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical constraints of time and resources, while adhering to strict ethical and legal boundaries. The professional challenge lies in identifying the most effective and compliant method to gather necessary information for a robust risk assessment without overstepping boundaries or compromising the integrity of the assessment itself. Careful judgment is required to select an approach that is both thorough and ethically sound, ensuring that all actions are authorized and documented. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes obtaining explicit authorization for all data collection activities. This aligns with the fundamental ethical principle of consent and the legal requirement for authorization in penetration testing and security assessments. By focusing on authorized reconnaissance and vulnerability scanning, the ethical hacker ensures that their actions are within the scope of engagement and do not constitute unauthorized access or surveillance, which would violate numerous cybersecurity laws and ethical codes of conduct. This methodical approach builds trust with the client and provides a solid foundation for a legally defensible risk assessment. An incorrect approach that involves passively collecting publicly available information without explicit authorization for the purpose of a risk assessment, while seemingly benign, can still lead to ethical and regulatory issues. If this passive collection is not clearly defined within the scope of the engagement, it could be misconstrued as unauthorized data gathering. Furthermore, relying solely on passive information might not provide the depth of insight required for a comprehensive risk assessment, potentially leading to an incomplete or inaccurate evaluation of the client's security posture. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to exploit identified vulnerabilities without prior explicit permission to do so, is a severe ethical and legal violation. This crosses the line from ethical hacking into unauthorized access and potentially malicious activity. It directly contravenes the core principles of ethical hacking, which mandate operating within authorized boundaries and causing no harm. Such actions would expose the ethical hacker to significant legal repercussions and professional sanctions, and would completely invalidate the risk assessment. A further incorrect approach, such as conducting social engineering tests without specific, documented authorization for each test, is also professionally unacceptable. While social engineering can be a valuable part of a risk assessment, it carries significant ethical implications. Without clear consent and defined parameters, it can lead to privacy violations, reputational damage for the client, and legal liabilities. Ethical practice demands that any social engineering activities are meticulously planned, approved, and executed with the utmost care to minimize harm and respect individual rights. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the engagement scope, explicit written authorization for all activities, and a continuous ethical review of proposed actions. Professionals should always prioritize transparency with the client, document all steps taken, and adhere strictly to legal and ethical guidelines. When in doubt, seeking clarification from the client or legal counsel is paramount. The goal is always to provide valuable security insights while upholding the highest standards of integrity and professionalism. Question 20. Performance analysis shows that a financial services firm is experiencing an increasing number of sophisticated phishing attacks targeting its customer data. As an ethical hacker tasked with conducting a risk assessment, which approach would best identify and prioritize the most critical risks to the organization's sensitive financial information and customer trust, considering the firm's regulatory obligations? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive vulnerability scan across all internal and external systems, followed by a detailed analysis of all identified vulnerabilities, prioritizing remediation based on the sheer number of findings. Option B. Rely solely on publicly available threat intelligence feeds related to financial services to identify potential attack vectors and assess their risk without specific context of the firm's internal environment. Option C. Focus exclusively on identifying the latest zero-day exploits that could be used against the firm's web applications, as these represent the most technically advanced threats. Option D. Begin by understanding the firm's business objectives, critical assets, including customer data, and the specific regulatory requirements for data protection and privacy. Then map potential threats and vulnerabilities to these assets and requirements to determine impact and likelihood. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive vulnerability scan across all internal and external systems, followed by a detailed analysis of all identified vulnerabilities, prioritizing remediation based on the sheer number of findings. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking, balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical constraints of time and resources, all while adhering to regulatory frameworks. The professional challenge lies in identifying the most impactful risks without getting bogged down in minutiae, ensuring that the assessment remains actionable and aligned with organizational objectives and legal obligations. Careful judgment is required to prioritize threats that pose the greatest potential harm to the organization's assets and reputation, considering the specific industry and its regulatory landscape. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it focuses on a systematic, layered methodology that begins with understanding the business context and then progressively drills down into technical vulnerabilities. This aligns with the principles of risk management mandated by various regulatory bodies, which emphasize identifying, assessing, and mitigating risks to information assets. By prioritizing threats based on their likelihood and impact, and by considering the organization's specific threat profile, the assessment becomes more effective and efficient. This approach ensures that resources are allocated to address the most critical security gaps, thereby enhancing the overall security posture and demonstrating due diligence in compliance with relevant laws and ethical standards. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on technical vulnerabilities without understanding the business context fails to identify risks that may not be purely technical but could have significant business impact, such as reputational damage or regulatory fines. This oversight can lead to a misallocation of resources and a false sense of security. Another incorrect approach that relies on outdated or generic threat intelligence ignores the organization's specific environment and evolving threat landscape, making the assessment less relevant and potentially missing critical, context-specific risks. This can result in non-compliance with regulations that require a tailored risk assessment. An approach that prioritizes the discovery of the largest number of vulnerabilities, regardless of their exploitability or impact, is inefficient and can overwhelm stakeholders with low-priority findings, hindering effective remediation efforts. This can also lead to failure to meet regulatory requirements for risk prioritization and mitigation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the organization's business objectives, critical assets, and regulatory obligations. This context then informs the scope and methodology of the risk assessment. The process should involve identifying potential threats and vulnerabilities, analyzing their likelihood and impact, and then prioritizing them for remediation. Regular review and updates to the risk assessment are crucial to adapt to changing threats and business environments. This structured approach ensures that the risk assessment is not just a technical exercise, but a strategic tool for improving the organization's security and compliance posture.